And on that point, I think it would be appropriate if we were for all businesses coming up in the House, where Minister speeches particularly, it seems to be since we came to the Convention Centre that we don't seem to get copies of them. I think it would be appropriate if there was a note possibly sent from your offices to all the ministers suggesting that should happen. First of all, in regard to this piece of legislation, the issue here is in regard to, and the Minister has pointed out, I think pretty clearly, is in regard to the very small minority of premises that have acted outside of the restrictions and have flouted the restrictions, and they are very much in the minority. The vast majority of licensed premises have acted very responsibly and have done their best to work within the guidelines that have been set in place. Of course, we are in a position where those very small number of people who may do that and do it on a consistent basis have to be called to book to some extent. I think that's really what this is all about, is making sure that we get them called to book. The issue here for many of us, I think, is that we find that we're in a position today that we should not be in. It's because the stuff that was done previously and the way this was handled in the past in regard to allowing some premises to open and others not to open on the basis of whether or not they serve food, I think has created a huge problem. Because I know certainly in my part of the country, and indeed every other people that I'm deputies to talk from everywhere around the country, it's the same thing. We have towns around the whole of Ireland where you have maybe 7 or 8 pubs and 2 of them are operating and the rest are closed and they're looking on. And that is a totally inappropriate situation. And the reality is that if in that town 7 or 8 of those pubs, that if they were all open, the crowds would be much smaller in them and we wouldn't have this situation at all. We also have to recognise, I think, that the vast majority of publicans, and we have a country which unfortunately has got a reputation for abuse of alcoholism in many ways, and that's something that's often spoken of and indeed thrown up at us. But in fairness, our licensed trade do an excellent job, and they can be trusted to deal with people in an appropriate way, and have been up to now. Our teachers can be trusted to bring their children back to school. Everyone in our society is working well together, and if that can happen there, I think it is not beyond the bounds of possibility that the government should be able to sit down with the Vintners Association, with everybody else, and work out a situation and a scheme that will work for everyone, rather than putting themselves into the position that they've had up to now. The reality is that this type of legislation is required, I think, for the very small minority of situations. I've spoken to members of An Garda Síochána who told me that they have been in a very difficult position because they have been unable to act in an appropriate way when they move into these situations. We recognise, that it's difficult for the Gardaí to walk into a place and to decide whether or not people have had food or haven't had food. To be able to adjudicate these matters is the most difficult and I suppose, erroneous of a situation for them. And we have to try and have something in place that where there is clear flouting of the legislation, where basically the people are putting their 2 fingers up to the authorities, that there has to be some recourse. And that's what this is about. And, in that context, I think we support the concept of it. And we absolutely support and recognise that there has to be measures in place to try and do this. The reality is that, the rescue scheme that has been put in place and that to try and assist the other pubs that are out there, I think is something that is coming too late for very many of them. I think it's something that government needs to look at. It's not going to be enough to get them over this situation. And I think many of the publicans, certainly in many parts of rural Ireland, which are of the least risk, are the ones that have suffered most in regard to all of this. And I think, the time has come now, quite apart from this piece of legislation, for government to focus and to work with all the parties in regard to this, particularly the vintners and the small rural pubs around the country, to come up with a solution that works for their customers and works for everyone involved. And that can happen, I think, as quickly as possible. We also have a situation, of course, where we have many other sectors out there where we have much bigger problems than we have with regard to the licensed trade. We have the situation, and many people have mentioned it, in regard to direct provision. We also have the situation in regard to all the meat factories and all of that. And yet, government seem to be continuously focusing on the licensed trade. I think, there needs to be a reality check in respect of that, and government needs to come back and look at that again and recognise that if we're going to have some kind of provisions in here to ensure that people who are in the licensed trade are the ones that are going to be somehow or other put pressure on to make sure they do the right thing, and as I say, in a minority of cases that needs to happen. At the same time, similar kinds of pressure needs to be brought to bear on those other sectors which have clearly flouted all of the regulations and continue to do so. And I particularly think the meat factories is the one that springs to mind everywhere around the country. And I think that the Minister and the Government need to look at this very seriously. and come up with the solutions for it. I look forward to the further debates to tease out the more detail in regard to this. I know concerns have been raised in regard to the regulations and to exactly how some measures may come into place at a further date. The Minister has assured me that any additional information is now been published on the website if it hasn't been already circulated. I think that needs to happen as quickly as possible, because it is inappropriate to leave deputies or leave the Parliament here in the dark in regard to these matters. I will now